Chapter 5. The Science of Disuse. When a person stops moving, the body begins to change. Muscles thin. Reflexes slow. The heart adapts to a smaller rhythm. It's not punishment. It's biology. The body, always efficient, rewires itself to match its environment. What most people don't realize is that the mind does the same thing. When emotional life goes unused, the brain trims away the circuits that sustain hope, curiosity, empathy, and motivation. That's not metaphor. It's neuroscience. And it's the core of what I call the science of disuse. How the brain learns to shrink. The human brain is an economy of effort. At birth, it overproduces synaptic connections. Millions more than it needs, and then begins a lifelong process of use it or lose it. The circuits we use most become highways, those we neglect dissolve into faint trails. That same rule applies not just to motor or sensory skills but to emotional and relational ones. When a child is consistently ignored, criticized, or emotionally isolated, their brain adapts to that reality. It prunes away the expectation of empathy and strengthens the circuits for vigilance and withdrawal. Neuroscientists call this adaptive calibration. It's the brain's attempt to make suffering survivable. But over time, the adaptation becomes the disorder. The hippocampus, the memory and learning center, shrinks under chronic stress. The amygdala, the threat detector, grows hyperactive. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning, empathy, and regulation, loses efficiency. In other words, the emotional brain learns to survive at the cost of thriving. When I first read those findings, it felt like someone had taken an MRI of my life. The biochemistry of being unseen. Neglect doesn't just change thoughts. It changes chemistry. Every time you reach for connection and don't receive it, the brain registers a social wound. Oxytocin, the hormone that bonds us to others, declines. Cortisol, the stress hormone, rises. Serotonin and dopamine, the messengers of mood and motivation, fluctuate unpredictably. The body moves into a chronic low-level fight or flight state. For a while, you can live like that. You even look functional. But internally, the system is overclocking. A car idling at red line. Eventually, it burns out. That's when psychological atrophy sets in. The chemistry of connection is replaced by the chemistry of endurance. The isolation studies. Beginning in the 1950s, scientists started studying what happens to humans and animals in isolation. The results were disturbing and illuminating. Harry Harlow's rhesus monkeys clung to soft cloth surrogates instead of wire ones with food, proving that emotional comfort is a survival need. Solitary confinement research found that even short-term sensory and social deprivation causes hallucinations, anxiety, and cognitive decline. Modern fMRI studies show that loneliness activates the same pain centers in the brain as physical injury. Aging research links social isolation to higher risks of dementia, heart disease, and premature death. Developmental psychology confirms that neglected children show measurable delays in language, empathy, and self-regulation. Every study tells the same story: the brain is not designed to go it alone. Connection isn't just emotional, it's nutritional. Without it, the brain starves. Disuse in daily life. You don't need to live in solitary confinement to experience disuse. It happens in ordinary lives, quietly. A teenager whose family never asks about their feelings. A spouse who stops talking because every conversation turns to criticism. An elderly parent left out of family decisions. A friend who texts but never hears back. Each moment of ignored reach teaches the brain a micro-lesson: don't bother. Over time, those lessons accumulate until whole parts of the psyche fall silent. Motivation fades. Joy feels foreign. Effort feels dangerous. This is the subtle science of disuse, the small, daily neglects that become neurological architecture. From adaptation to atrophy. At first, psychological disuse is adaptive. It saves energy. The mind learns to live on less stimulation, less risk, less vulnerability. But as the years go on, those same protective mechanisms turn against you. A person who suppresses emotion to avoid conflict loses emotional fluency. Someone who never receives empathy loses the ability to interpret it. Someone who learns to expect disappointment begins to self-sabotage before disappointment can arrive. This is the paradox of atrophy. The strategies that once kept you safe become the same ones that keep you small. And because the process is slow, it's rarely recognized until it's advanced. The brain's redemption clause, neuroplasticity. Here's the good news, the single most hopeful fact neuroscience has ever discovered. The brain can change back. Neuroplasticity means that the brain remains capable of forming new connections throughout life. Even after years of neglect, new relational and sensory experiences can rebuild the architecture of trust and emotion. Every time we try something new, learning a skill, expressing a feeling, forming a bond, neurons fire in new sequences. With repetition, those circuits strengthen. The mind literally reconditions itself. MRI studies show increased gray matter density in people who meditate, practice gratitude, or engage in meaningful community. Trauma survivors who participate in consistent therapy demonstrate measurable changes in amygdala and prefrontal regulation. Social reconnection is as biologically healing as medication or exercise. Healing isn't magic, it's mechanics. The psychology of reconditioning. If psychological atrophy is a loss of function through disuse, then healing is a return of function through safe repetition. That's what recovery really is, emotional physical therapy. Every act of honesty exercises a muscle of truth. Every act of forgiveness stretches empathy. Every time you stay present when you'd rather flee, the nervous system learns a new pattern. At first, it's exhausting, like rebuilding after an injury. But over time, what felt impossible becomes effortless. That's the hallmark of reconditioning, when what was once unsafe begins to feel natural again. Hope in motion. I remember my first small victory at reaching out recovery, laughing freely in a group conversation. For a split second, I forgot to brace myself. It wasn't monumental, but it was new. That night, my panic was quieter. My chest felt less tight. That's when I understood, healing doesn't arrive as lightning, it arrives as motion. Each safe interaction, each moment of being seen, tells the brain, it's okay to move again. Neurons fire. Pathways strengthen. The emotional muscles return. The collective science of belonging. What happens in individual brains scales to communities. Neighborhoods with higher trust and cooperation have lower rates of crime, illness, and addiction. Workplaces with psychological safety outperform those ruled by fear. Countries with stronger social support systems report higher happiness and longevity. Connection, it turns out, is not just moral, it's measurable. It's the ultimate antidote to disuse, both individually and collectively. If disconnection is disease, then belonging is biology. Closing reflection. The science of disuse teaches a truth both sobering and empowering. We are built to connect. When we don't, we decline. When we do, we rebuild. The mind is not a static organ but a living ecosystem, one that responds to every gesture of care, every act of courage, every safe human moment. No matter how long it's been idle, it remembers movement. It waits, patiently, for a signal that life is still worth reaching for. And when that signal finally arrives, through a kind word, a steady friendship, a second chance, the brain doesn't just respond. It rejoices. End of Chapter 5, The Science of Disuse. This one is pivotal. It connects the personal science of disconnection to the public consequences, showing how loneliness at home becomes corruption in society. Chapter 10, Psychedelics, Psilocybin, and the Neurobiology of Repair. This chapter explores how recent scientific studies on psilocybin intersect with your concept of psychological atrophy, how relational neglect shrinks emotional capacities, and what role controlled psychedelic-assisted therapy might play in restoring neural and emotional flexibility. Opening reflection. When the mind has hardened. For years, I felt like parts of me had calcified. Emotional responsiveness, openness, creative curiosity, slowly, they dulled. I began to believe that the only way to break through was a radical shake to the nervous system, a reset. I often wondered, is there a medicine for emotional atrophy? It was during this time I began reading about psilocybin and how it might open pathways in the mind long closed by neglect, trauma, or silence. That hope, not a silver bullet, but a possibility, became part of my research and faith in recovery. What science says: psilocybin and brain connectivity. Psilocybin is a compound found in certain magic mushrooms that exerts profound effects on brain networks and consciousness. In controlled clinical settings, its potential to catalyze psychological insight, emotional breakthrough, and neuroplasticity is being actively studied. Some findings: default mode network, DMN, disruption and reconfiguration. Research shows that psilocybin disrupts the brain's default mode network, the network associated with self-referential thought, rumination, and the background chatter of the mind. This disruption allows for a temporary unfreezing of rigid patterns, making new connections and perspectives possible. Increased network diversity and entropy. Under psilocybin, the brain exhibits more varied connectivity states. Neural pathways that were previously dormant may activate, and connections between regions that seldom talked can open. Neuroplasticity and new connections. Animal studies, e.g. mice, indicate that psilocybin can promote growth in dendritic spines, tiny neural projections that help neurons connect, both in number and size, persisting for days or even weeks after administration. This suggests a structural basis for sustained change, not just fleeting effects. Dose-dependent effects. Interestingly, the impact of psilocybin on neurogenesis, generation of new neurons, appears dose-sensitive. Low doses in animal models may enhance progenitor growth in hippocampal areas, while higher doses may suppress it. Protective and repair mechanisms. In animal stroke models, psilocybin has been shown to reduce neuronal damage, upregulate BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a key player in neuronal health, and increase synaptic proteins, MAP2, synaptophysin, while reducing markers of inflammation. These findings hint that psilocybin may not just open pathways, it may help repair and protect them under certain conditions. Human depression trials and connectivity. In depressed humans, psilocybin has been documented to rewire connectivity, reducing hyperactivity in tightly stuck networks and increasing cross-network integration, thereby flattening rigid thought patterns and opening new psychological flexibility. Linking to psychological atrophy. How do these findings connect to your concept of psychological atrophy? Let me walk through the parallels and possible mechanisms. Atrophy mechanism. Psilocybin mechanism/evidence. Theoretical healing link. Neural disuse and shrinkage. Reduced synaptic connections and neural pathway retraction in neglected circuits. Psilocybin's promotion of new dendritic growth helps restore those pathways. Rigid thought patterns and self-limiting identity. DMN hyperactivity entrenches self-concept. Psilocybin disturbs DMN rigidity. Disrupting the DMN may allow release from self-limiting narratives. Emotional blunting/numbness. Lack of novel connectivity reduces emotional responsiveness. Broadened neural integration may restore emotional range and sensitivity. Reduced cognitive flexibility and empathy. Atrophy inhibits cross-network communication. Psilocybin-induced cross-network connectivity fosters more flexible thinking and emotional resonance. Entrenched defensive postures. Defensive circuits dominate processing. Temporary depatterning by psilocybin allows reorganization and re-engagement with disused circuits. In short, psilocybin may act as a neural jumpstart, temporarily releasing the mind from rigid constraints, enabling reconnection, and then helping support new, healthier patterns over time. Limitations, risks, and ethical considerations. Because psilocybin is powerful, its use and integration must be treated carefully. Some constraints to accept. Controlled setting required. Most positive effects are seen in supervised, therapeutic settings, not recreational use. Safety, set and setting, psychological support matter critically. Dose sensitivity. Too high a dose may overwhelm rather than heal, too low may not reach threshold for change. Animal data show nonlinear effects. Transient side effects. During administration, cognitive performance and memory may decrease transiently. Not a standalone cure. Psilocybin is not magic. Its best outcomes are when integrated with psychotherapy or relational work. Legal and social barriers. In many jurisdictions, psilocybin is illegal or heavily regulated, complicating access. Heterogeneity of response. Individuals respond differently. What triggers profound emotional healing in one person may be destabilizing in another. Narrative example, anonymized/fictive composite. Let me tell you about Maya, a composite drawn from many stories I've encountered. Maya grew up feeling emotionally invisible. She internalized that her value depended on not being a burden. Over time, her emotional life dulled. She struggled to trust, to open up, to feel joy. She began therapy, journaling, community work, but her progress plateaued. In a therapeutic retreat setting, she underwent a carefully guided psilocybin session with psychological support. During that session, she experienced what she described as the walls between me and others dissolving. Old memories, suppressed feelings, and relational trauma surfaced in symbolic form. Afterwards, over months of integration work, she reported that old modes of self-doubt receded, she could write poetry again, and she reconnected emotionally with trusted friends. Importantly, the experience didn't fix all her pain, but it cracked the seal of rigidity long enough for relational healing to take root. In Maya's case, the psilocybin session acted as a catalyst, not the whole cure, enabling renewed emotional plasticity. Integrating psilocybin into a recovery model. Given what we now know, here's how psilocybin might plausibly sit within a reconditioning model for psychological atrophy, complementary, not primary. Preparation/safety baseline. Establish relational safety, stable functioning, therapeutic trust. The person must have enough internal and external support. Guided experience. With skilled supervision, the psychedelic session supports deep processing or symbolic engagement with relational wounds, shame, or exclusion. Integration work. After the experience, therapy, journaling, relational sharing, and relational repair work help translate insights into ongoing neural and emotional reconditioning. Relational embodiment. Safe relationships, community belonging, and accountability reinforce new pathways, preventing relapse into old atrophy circuits. Follow-up and maintenance. Occasional booster sessions or microdosing may help, but the majority of change comes from persistent relationship, creativity, and emotional practice. Caution for readers. This section is clearly framed as emerging science, not dogma. The primary claim of this book is to explore how domestic discrimination can turn into psychological atrophy and which can turn into social harm. The psilocybin discussion is a complementary, exploratory chapter. Transparency about legality, risk, and the importance of supervision. Closing reflection. Reading the research on psilocybin, I felt something familiar, possibility. If long neglect weakens emotional circuits, then perhaps, under the right conditions, the mind can be reawoken. Psilocybin offers a model of how the brain can rewire, reconnect, and reliberate when given the chance. But its promise depends on integration, relationship, and care, not escape. This chapter is not a prescription. It is a bridge connecting what's possible in neuroscience to what you already know in your body, that healing requires both mystery and muscle. In the next chapter, we'll return to the architecture of recovery. How you train relational muscles, how systems support or block belonging, and what rituals help convert insight into sustained reconditioning. This book tries to blend science, storytelling, and meaning to encourage readers learn while they feel. This chapter will explain the neuroscience of disuse, how emotional neglect affects the brain and body. Show how that connects to your concept of psychological atrophy. Offer relatable examples and imagery for accessibility. End with the science of reconditioning and neuroplastic recovery, proving hope is real and measurable. Chapter 6. The Emotional Economy of Exile. Every civilization is built on invisible economies, not just of money or power, but of emotion. Trust, empathy, reciprocity, and belonging are the currencies that keep societies stable. When those currencies collapse, everything else follows: markets, morals, and minds. This is the emotional economy of exile, the hidden exchange rate between private neglect and public decay. Exile without distance. Exile doesn't always mean leaving home. Sometimes it means living inside a home where your presence no longer counts as membership. You eat at the same table, breathe the same air, but your contributions don't register, your needs go unbudgeted. That's what I call internal exile, being present but emotionally deported. When this happens in a family, the individual atrophies. When it happens across thousands of families, a society does. Because the skills we learn in our private relationships, listening, empathy, repair, are the same skills that sustain justice, fairness, and accountability in public life. If those skills die in the home, they die in the culture. The emotional supply chain. Think of empathy as a raw material, mined early in life through safe relationships, processed through education, and distributed through institutions. When supply runs low, everything built from it begins to crumble. Families are the factories where empathy is manufactured. Schools are the shipping routes that distribute it through cooperation and teamwork. Communities are the retail spaces where empathy gets exchanged for trust and belonging. Governments are the regulators meant to ensure fair distribution. But when families discriminate emotionally, when certain members are marginalized, silenced, or shamed, the entire supply chain weakens. Children grow up emotionally undernourished. Schools inherit fear instead of curiosity. Workplaces reward performance over compassion. Governments mirror the coldness of their citizens. The result is not random chaos, it's systemic emotional bankruptcy. How exile becomes economy. A person raised in emotional scarcity learns to survive on deficit. They internalize that resources, love, attention, safety, are limited, and someone else must lose for them to win. That's how the poverty mindset begins, long before money enters the picture. In the emotional economy of exile, scarcity isn't financial, it's psychological. People hoard validation the way others hoard wealth. They exploit vulnerability the way corporations exploit labor. They manipulate loyalty the way regimes manipulate faith. It's all the same structure, learned early, repeated often. Poverty, crime, and corruption are not simply moral failings, they are symptoms of relational economies that teach deprivation as truth. The neuroeconomics of disconnection. Modern neuroscience gives us a window into why this happens. When people live in chronic social exclusion, the brain's reward system rewires. Acts of cooperation or altruism no longer trigger the same dopamine responses. The amygdala, the brain's threat detector, dominates decision-making. This means that fear, not fairness, drives behavior. In contrast, societies with high social cohesion show stronger activation in the brain's empathy and reward networks during cooperative tasks. In other words, belonging literally changes what feels good. This explains why some environments naturally foster generosity and innovation while others breed corruption and cynicism. They operate on different neurochemical economies. One runs on trust, the other runs on threat. Crime is a cry for connection. Every criminologist knows that crime is often rooted in disconnection. People who feel invisible seek intensity, even destructive forms of it, just to feel alive. Theft, violence, addiction, exploitation, these are distorted attempts at stimulation in a starved nervous system. When someone says, "I didn't care," what they really mean is, "I couldn't feel." That's not an excuse, it's an explanation. In a brain atrophied by neglect, empathy circuits lie dormant. Risk feels like relief. Chaos feels like proof of existence. We punish behavior but ignore its biology. We build prisons when we should be building belonging. Poverty is inherited disconnection. Material poverty and emotional poverty are twins, born from the same neglect. A child raised without emotional security learns that the world is unreliable. That worldview becomes a psychological template: don't invest, don't trust, don't expect fairness. In adulthood, this translates into reduced risk-taking, low financial literacy, and self-protective pessimism. Economic behavior mirrors emotional conditioning. That's why interventions that only provide money often fail unless they also rebuild confidence, connection, and self-worth. People can't plan for futures they don't believe they deserve. When policy ignores psychology, poverty persists. Corruption as institutionalized atrophy. Corruption is what happens when emotional scarcity reaches the top of the hierarchy. It is the moral form of hoarding. Those in power accumulate safety, status, or wealth at others' expense, not because they're evil, but because they've been trained to see trust as risk and empathy as weakness. The same logic that allows a parent to gaslight a child allows a politician to lie to a nation. Both are acts of control disguised as care. Both stem from the same deficit, a fear of accountability. Corruption, then, is not the opposite of morality, it's the extension of emotional neglect into policy. It's psychological atrophy with a title and a pension. When belonging becomes a luxury. In emotionally impoverished societies, belonging becomes a privilege instead of a birthright. People compete for inclusion the way they once competed for food. Social media, consumerism, and identity politics all feed this hunger. Offering connection without intimacy, validation without accountability. It's a survival adaptation in a world that has forgotten how to nurture. We're starving for something that can't be bought. The mathematics of empathy. If economists tracked empathy the way they track GDP, they would find an inverse correlation between inequality and compassion. When the gap between the safe and the unsafe widens, empathy collapses. The wealthy insulate themselves, the poor harden themselves, the middle disassociates. This is how domestic discrimination scales into global imbalance. Families teach selective compassion, and nations replicate it in policy. The result is a humanity divided into castes of perceived worth. What began as a quiet exclusion in one home becomes an algorithm that governs billions. Repairing the emotional economy. Repair begins where the collapse began, in relationship. Empathy, like currency, must circulate to retain value. We restore economies of care the same way we restore physical economies, by reinvesting in the neglected. Here's how that looks in practice. Micro-level, families and friendships practice open dialogue, repair after conflict, and unconditional regard. Meso-level, schools and workplaces reward collaboration over competition, emotional literacy over performance. Macro-level, governments measure well-being alongside productivity, funding programs that build social cohesion and trust. In all three levels, the principle is the same: belonging is infrastructure. You can't build sustainable systems on emotional debt. A moment of reflection. During one of my recovery meetings, a man once said, "I didn't start stealing because I wanted things. I started because I wanted to matter." That line stayed with me. It captured the whole emotional economy of exile in a single sentence. When people can't matter through love, they'll matter through disruption. When empathy fails, adrenaline replaces it. And that's how emotional bankruptcy becomes social instability. From exile to citizenship. The opposite of exile isn't return, it's participation. To reverse psychological atrophy, people need places to contribute, not just places to heal. Communities that welcome wounded people back into purpose, as mentors, artists, volunteers, are not just compassionate, they're strategic. Every recovered empath is a restored citizen. Every healed family is a small government learning how to be honest again. That's the real antidote to crime and corruption, the recreation of belonging. Closing reflection. Poverty, crime, and corruption are not random misfortunes. They are predictable outcomes of emotional economies built on exclusion. When love is rationed, fairness vanishes. When connection is conditional, conscience collapses. We cannot legislate morality without legislating belonging. We cannot heal nations without healing homes. Because the future of civilization will not be decided by markets or militaries, but by whether we remember that the human heart, like any currency, loses value when it stops being shared. End of Chapter 6, The Emotional Economy of Exile. Chapter 7. Psychological Malnutrition. You can survive a long time without love. You can build routines, go to work, even laugh at the right moments. But like a body living on junk food, the mind eventually begins to weaken when it's deprived of the nutrients it was designed to receive. That is what I call psychological malnutrition, the emotional equivalent of starvation in a world full of noise. It's not the absence of people. It's the absence of nourishment within connection. The body keeps the score, and so does the heart. Medical science has long known that malnutrition in childhood stunts growth, weakens immunity, and shortens lifespan. What we're only beginning to understand is that emotional malnutrition does the same, not to the bones, but to the spirit. A human being fed on criticism instead of care, control instead of compassion, and silence instead of safety develops psychological scurvy, brittle self-esteem, inflamed anxiety, and fragile hope. Just like a body deprived of vitamins, the psyche deprived of affection and affirmation can't synthesize the chemicals that make resilience possible. The nutrients of connection. In every healthy emotional system, family, friendship, community, 5 primary nutrients sustain psychological well-being. They can't be replaced by technology, money, or medication. Each fulfills a specific biological and social function. Emotional nutrient. Description. Biological correlate. Absence leads to validation. Being seen and acknowledged without judgment. Releases oxytocin and serotonin. Shame, doubt, emotional isolation. Presence. Consistent, attentive availability. Regulates cortisol and calms the nervous system. Hypervigilance, anxiety, emotional dysregulation. Communication. Honest, clear exchange of thoughts and feelings. Strengthens prefrontal cortex and empathy networks. Misunderstanding, reactivity, cognitive rigidity. Touch and affection. Safe physical or verbal reassurance of belonging. Activates vagus nerve, reduces pain perception. Numbness, dissociation, distrust of intimacy. Humor and play. Shared joy and creative expression. Boosts dopamine, resilience, and social bonding. Apathy, stagnation, inability to imagine joy. When these nutrients circulate freely, the emotional ecosystem thrives. When one or more go missing, psychological immunity weakens. Over time, this leads to emotional inflammation, the chronic tension and fatigue that modern life so often mistakes for personality. Validation, the vitamin of visibility. The need to be seen is as ancient as hunger. Validation doesn't mean praise, it means recognition. I see what you're feeling, and it makes sense. Infants cry not just for food but for acknowledgement. Adults do the same, only quieter. When our experiences are mirrored accurately, the brain integrates them. When they're dismissed or mocked, the memory fragments, stored without resolution. Psychologists call this unmet mirroring need. I call it invisible malnutrition. It starves the developing sense of self until self-worth must be earned externally, through performance, perfectionism, or rebellion. In societies where validation is rationed, image replaces authenticity. People stop being themselves and start being acceptable versions of themselves. And the hunger never ends. Presence, the protein of safety. You can't download presence. It requires time, stillness, and attention, commodities rarer than gold in a distracted world. To be present with another person is to lend them your nervous system for a moment, helping theirs find rhythm. That's why calm parents calm children and why kind friends can lower heart rate and blood pressure just by being near. Chronic absence, even in physically present relationships, teaches the body that safety is conditional. This leads to hypervigilance. The internal thermostat is stuck on alert. Over time, the system exhausts itself. Presence, then, is not just comfort, it's regulation. Without it, we live in a state of perpetual fight or flight, mistaking tension for normalcy. Communication, the oxygen of connection. Healthy communication is not just talking, it's translating emotion into shared understanding. When families or societies stop communicating honestly, emotional oxygen thins. People suffocate in politeness or explode in panic. The brain's language centers are directly linked to its emotional processing regions. When we articulate our experiences, in words, art, or music, we metabolize them. Unspoken emotion, like undigested food, becomes toxic. That's why secrets and silence corrode relationships faster than conflict. They starve mutual understanding. They turn people into strangers in familiar rooms. Touch and affection, the warmth that regulates. Humans are wired for touch. Skin-to-skin contact releases oxytocin, stabilizes heart rate, and reduces stress hormones. It says, you belong to a body of others. But in many modern or trauma-affected families, touch becomes absent, unsafe, or transactional. The result is a generation of people who can have sex but not intimacy, conversation but not connection. Emotional hunger often disguises itself as physical craving. That's why affection-starved people sometimes chase intensity, drama, addiction, overwork, anything that feels like contact. They're not addicted to chaos, they're starving for comfort. Humor and play, the antioxidants of the psyche. Play is not frivolous, it's regenerative. It's how humans process complexity without collapse. Laughter releases dopamine and endorphins, loosening the grip of fear and rigidity. Without play, the nervous system forgets flexibility. It becomes brittle, serious, and self-protective. In that state, joy feels foreign, or even threatening. Societies that lose their sense of humor often slide into authoritarianism. Families that lose play lose resilience. Play is how we remind the brain that safety still exists. How malnutrition becomes systemic. Psychological malnutrition rarely ends with the individual. Emotionally deprived people often create emotionally deprived institutions. Leaders raised on control reproduce it in governance. Teachers raised on silence replicate it in classrooms. Corporations run by emotionally stunted executives design workplaces that value compliance over creativity. The pattern spreads like a deficiency in a population, invisible, devastating, and self-perpetuating. That's why social progress requires not only economic reform but emotional literacy, policies, and cultures that feed the human spirit as intentionally as the body. The symptoms of a starving society. If we were doctors diagnosing a nation's emotional health, we'd find the following symptoms everywhere. Information obesity but emotional starvation, we consume data, not connection. Productivity addiction, working harder to fill a void that only belonging can satisfy. Polarization, anger is the only socially acceptable form of vulnerability. Addiction and escapism, self-medication for the ache of invisibility. Loss of curiosity, a mind too undernourished to explore beyond its fears. These aren't moral failings, they're malnutrition signs. We are creatures built to feed one another emotionally, and we've forgotten the recipe. Refeeding the starved mind. Just as a body recovering from starvation must reintroduce food slowly and safely, the mind recovering from neglect needs gradual renourishment. Start with microvalidation. Small, truthful acknowledgments of effort or pain. Create presence rituals. Shared meals, no phone conversations, check-ins. Revive curiosity. Ask questions you don't know the answers to. Relearn affection. Safe touch, kind words, gentle humor. Reclaim play. Creative projects, community games, moments of silliness. Over time, the nervous system relearns fullness. Joy no longer feels like danger. Connection stops feeling like work. That's the refeeding process, the slow return of psychological appetite. Closing reflection. When people say society is sick, they often mean morally or politically. But beneath those symptoms lies something simpler: we are malnourished. We've mistaken stimulation for sustenance, attention for affection, performance for presence. But deep down, the human heart still knows what it needs: to be seen, soothed, understood, touched, and invited to laugh. The cure for psychological malnutrition is not complex. It's compassion, practiced daily, until the world remembers how to feed each other again. End of Chapter 7, Psychological Malnutrition. This is where the work shifts from diagnosis to rehabilitation, showing that recovery from emotional neglect is not only possible but scientifically and spiritually grounded. Chapter 8. The Reconditioning Process. Healing the mind isn't about erasing the past, it's about retraining what the past taught us to fear. Like any muscle that's atrophied from disuse, the psyche needs gradual, repetitive, safe motion to recover. That's the essence of reconditioning. Psychological atrophy is not a death sentence. It's a call to movement. Why healing requires repetition. When people begin emotional recovery, they often expect transformation to arrive like revelation, a single conversation, an apology, a new relationship that changes everything. But the nervous system doesn't heal through revelation, it heals through repetition. Every time you engage in a safe, supportive interaction, neurons fire in new configurations. Each repetition strengthens those circuits. Over weeks and months, what was once fragile becomes instinct. That's why reconditioning is not glamorous work, it's practice. And practice is what rewires the brain. The physical therapy of the mind. In physical rehabilitation, movement is introduced in small, controlled doses. Too much strain too soon re-injures the tissue, too little keeps it weak. Psychological recovery follows the same rule. After long periods of isolation or emotional neglect, the first attempts at connection can feel painful, like stretching a muscle that hasn't moved in years. That pain doesn't mean you're doing it wrong, it means you're waking up. The key is consistency without overwhelm. A little motion every day, a small conversation, a moment of self-honesty, a single expression of gratitude, builds endurance. Safety is the splint that holds new growth in place. Step 1. Stabilization, creating safety. Before strength training comes stabilization. The first step in reconditioning is to establish a baseline of safety, physical, emotional, and environmental. Physical safety, a stable living situation, access to rest, nutrition, and predictable routines. Emotional safety, people or spaces where you can speak without being punished or pathologized. Internal safety, tools like deep breathing, grounding, or journaling that regulate your nervous system. Safety is not luxury, it's the soil in which all healing grows. Without it, progress is temporary. This phase can take months or years, and that's okay. Rushing safety is like watering concrete. Step 2. Activation, small, safe movements. Once safety is established, the next step is to activate dormant circuits, the parts of the self that have gone numb. This can include sharing small truths instead of rehearsed responses, taking up creative or physical hobbies that reintroduce play, making eye contact during conversation, reaching out to others, even when your brain says, "Don't bother." Each small act reintroduces motion into your emotional musculature. At first, it feels awkward, like learning to walk again. But each repetition teaches your nervous system a new lesson: connection can be safe. Step 3. Endurance, building capacity for consistency. Once activation begins, the focus shifts to sustaining it. This is where many people relapse, not because they lack willpower, but because endurance has to be trained. Endurance in emotional life means staying connected even when it's inconvenient, staying honest even when it's uncomfortable, and staying compassionate even when it's not reciprocated. This is the stage where community becomes vital. Human beings can't maintain emotional endurance alone. Mutual accountability, support groups, mentors, honest friends, acts like a spotter in the gym. Without community, effort collapses back into old patterns. With community, progress compounds. Step 4. Strength, reclaiming agency. As capacity grows, so does strength, the ability to take responsibility for your life without collapsing into guilt or resentment. Strength is not control. It's the confidence that comes from predictability, knowing you can survive discomfort without losing yourself. In this stage, people begin to rebuild boundaries, pursue meaningful work, and engage in advocacy or creative expression. Their relationships shift from dependency to partnership. Strength means becoming an active participant in your own life again. It's the opposite of helplessness, and the antidote to atrophy. Step 5. Integration, living from the rebuilt self. The final phase is integration, when new habits and neural patterns stabilize into identity. Healing stops being a project and becomes a lifestyle. Integration is quiet. It's no longer about dramatic realizations but subtle alignment. You find yourself reacting differently, pausing instead of panicking, forgiving instead of freezing, laughing where you once would have withdrawn. That's the moment you know reconditioning has worked. Your nervous system trusts life again. Tools of reconditioning. Each person's toolkit will look different, but the most effective methods share one trait: they reintroduce safe, embodied connection. Therapeutic dialogue. Consistent sessions with a trauma-informed counselor reinforce trust and interpretation. Creative expression. Writing, painting, or music externalize emotion safely. Physical movement. Yoga, dance, walking, all regulate the vagus nerve and release stored stress. Community engagement. Volunteering, peer support, shared meals rebuild social circuitry. Ritual and routine. Consistency communicates safety to the subconscious. Mindfulness and breath work. Strengthen the prefrontal cortex, calm the amygdala, and expand present moment awareness. Affection and laughter. Natural stimulants of oxytocin and dopamine, sustaining long-term motivation. Reconditioning is cumulative, each practice multiplies the effects of the others. It's not about perfection, it is about persistence. The brain's proof of change. Neuroscience now provides concrete evidence that reconditioning isn't just emotional, it's structural. MRI scans show increased gray matter in the hippocampus after mindfulness and cognitive therapy. Functional imaging reveals reduced amygdala activation in people who practice consistent emotional regulation. Heart rate variability studies prove that compassion-based practices improve vagal tone, a marker of nervous system flexibility. Longitudinal studies demonstrate that sustained social connection reduces mortality risk more than quitting smoking. Every hug, every journal entry, every shared laugh, these are acts of biological repair. They aren't sentimental, they're scientific. The role of creativity in healing. Creativity is one of the most overlooked therapies in existence. When words fail, art speaks. When logic breaks, rhythm restores. Creative expression reawakens dormant neural networks, especially those suppressed by shame or perfectionism. It doesn't matter if you're good at it, creativity isn't performance, it's metabolism. It digests the past into meaning. In that sense, art is not a luxury of the healed, it's a lifeline for the healing. The importance of community. No matter how dedicated or self-aware someone is, recovery in isolation is unsustainable. Belonging is the context that keeps change alive. Without it, new habits dissolve under stress. Communities of recovery, whether 12-step groups, faith circles, artistic collectives, or neighborhood initiatives, function as distributed nervous systems. They keep individuals regulated through collective presence. When one person falters, the others stabilize them. That's what families were meant to be, not perfect, but regulating. Reconditioning, then, is not just an individual process. It's the resurrection of community. The spiritual dimension. Every form of rehabilitation, physical, psychological, or social, eventually points to a deeper truth: connection is sacred. Whether one calls it God, love, or consciousness, the impulse to belong is our oldest prayer. To engage in reconditioning is to return to that sacred instinct, to remember that life, even after neglect, still wants to connect. This is where science and spirituality meet, both affirm that everything living seeks reunion. Closing reflection. Reconditioning is not a miracle. It's the patient choreography of repetition, trust, and time. It's doing small things consistently enough for the brain to believe you mean it this time. Healing doesn't erase history, it rewrites the body's response to it. The ghosts don't vanish, they simply learn to rest. When people ask me how long it takes, I tell them. As long as it takes for a scar to become skin. Because the goal isn't to forget the injury. The goal is to move freely again. End of Chapter 8, The Reconditioning Process. Chapter 8 was about personal reconditioning. This one zooms out to show how families, communities, and organizations can actively participate in collective reconditioning. It answers the question: what does a healthy environment look like? One that doesn't just treat wounds, but prevents them. Chapter 9. The Architecture of Recovery Communities.